Hello and welcome to this overview of the AQA GCSE History content, covering Part 2 of the America, Opportunity and Inequality course, Society during the Depression, the Effectiveness of the New Deal, and the Impact of the Second World War. We are going to be covering the content quite quickly, so if there is anything that you are unsure about, make sure to pause the video, take a note, and go back over it later. If you have not seen Part 1 of the course, make sure you have a look on my channel so that you can gain a full understanding of the course. To begin the first section of Part 2 of the course, we are going to talk about why Wall Street crashed. As we looked at in the earlier video, many people made lots of money by playing the stock market, but the stock market had reached a point where the companies stopped making as much money, and so their stocks became worth less. This is because of a number of reasons, including the overproduction of goods from many companies. A consumer society was created in the 1920s, but there came a point where most people already had the new, exciting things that companies were selling, decreasing demand. Many companies continued to produce goods at a high rate, however, decreasing the value of the goods and the profits of the companies. There were many economic problems in other areas too, like farming, some of which stemmed from the Republican government's laissez-faire approach to managing the country. This meant that there was still a large number living in poverty, with over 60% of the country earning below the minimum living wage at the time. As companies began to make less money, many started to sell their shares, motivating others to do the same. On what became known as a Black Thursday, the 24th of October, 1929, 13 million shares were sold. Many who had bought their shares with a loan were unable to pay it back, and faced problems with the bank, although many of these banks had to close as a result. Those who had money in these banks when they went bankrupt often lost it all. This sparked the Great Depression, which had huge impacts on almost everyone in society. The first affected group that we will talk about is the ordinary shareholders, who had lost fortunes on the stock market and were often forced to sell belongings, or even their homes, to survive. Factory workers also struggled, many losing their jobs and all the money that they had in savings when the banks closed. This had a large knock-on impact on other industries too. Factory owners were not affected as much, although their overproduction meant that they had to significantly reduce what they produced, get rid of many staff, and cut wages of those who remained, as a result of the dwindling demand. Those who worked in banks also lost their jobs when they ran out of money. Those with significant wealth were also not too affected, with lots of land on property to rely on, although did have to make some lifestyle changes to conserve money. The final group to mention is farmers, who were struggling even before the Depression. New machinery, which was often on loan, meant that they overproduced, decreasing produce value as they tried to sell the excess, and decreasing profits. Many lost their farms and had to fire staff. The Great Depression affected almost everyone in some way, and so there were huge impacts on society as a whole. Unemployment rose drastically, with over 25% of people losing their jobs by 1932, and as a result, homelessness increased hugely, with people unable to pay their mortgages. Many of these homeless people set up what became known as Hoovervilles, which were collections of shacks made out of waste material in urban wasteland. The name Hoovervilles comes from a criticism of the President Herbert Hoover, who many people thought wasn't doing enough to help the country. Many hobos, as they were known, also traveled the country in search of work. The desperate poverty in many communities meant that thousands relied on free food, with soup kitchens offering a meal to those waiting in the breadline. There were problems on the farms at this time too. The combination of unsustainable farming methods and a drought led to the Dust Bowl, making it impossible to farm. Hoover, leader of the Republican government, believed in rugged individualism, meaning that he wanted people to recover from their problems on their own. He did do some things to help, however, cutting taxes to give people more money, and setting up a dam and road building program that provided many construction jobs. Not all actions helped though, with his increased tax on foreign goods backfiring when other nations did the same to him, decreasing American exports, and only 10% of the $300 million that he allocated to helping the unemployed got distributed. As a result, many people were angry with the government. Farmers chased away officials trying to evict them, and protests called for change, like when 25,000 ex-soldiers marched to Washington, D.C., asking for their war pension early. Hoover chased them away with the army, using guns and tear gas. We are now going to talk about the 1932 election, which featured Herbert Hoover against Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoover was brought up an orphan, making millions of dollars by climbing his way up the mining ladder, working very hard to travel and get what he wanted. This led to him believing that others should do the same, in line with the Republican standpoint. Hoover was not a very good public speaker and often came across uncaring because of his political standpoint. As a result, he was very unpopular across the country and not welcomed during his vote campaigns. On the contrary, Roosevelt was a part of the Democratic Party, much more in favor of helping society however possible. He grew up rich, attended a private school, before working for the Navy during the First World War. This led to him contracting a spinal disease, leaving him wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life. Many argue that this helped the voters empathize with him, as he had overcome difficulties like the rest of them. He promised the 3 R's for if he were elected: relief, help for the old, vulnerable and unemployed, recovery, implementing schemes to provide jobs, and reform, making America a better place for ordinary people. He called this plan the New Deal, which excited many Americans and led to him winning the election by one of the largest victories in U.S. history. 42 out of 48 states chose him. However, the rules of the Constitution stated that Hoover had 4 months to finish his job, a time that became known as the lame duck months because of his reckless financial moves, once again increasing unemployment and forcing more banks to close. We are now going to move on to the second section, the effectiveness of the New Deal. Now that Roosevelt was president, his New Deal could take full effect. He made 3 main changes upon his election, the first regarding banks. More than 5,000 banks had closed since the crash, and so FDR made an effort to reopen them with enough funds, lending money to those that needed it. People began to regain their trust in banks, with many putting their money back into their accounts. The second change was aimed at helping the unemployed. FDR set up the Economy Act, reducing the pay of everyone in the government and armed forces, and saving almost $1 billion in the process. The third and final key change was removing prohibition under the Beer Act, putting the criminal gangs out of business and allowing the government to raise money by taxing the alcohol. In addition, as part of his New Deal, Roosevelt created the alphabet agencies, organizations that helped people get jobs. The phrase "priming the pump" describes the idea behind the agencies. By paying workers to do certain jobs, the government would see the benefit later when these workers bought goods, helping other businesses, who in turn hired more people, creating a cycle to reduce unemployment. Some of these agencies helped farmers by loaning money, like the FCA, or paying the farmers to produce less goods, so that the value of what they sold increased. Agencies were also set up to help workers, some promoting rights for fair conditions, wages, and the ability to join a trade union, while others gave loans to struggling homeowners or provided jobs in the construction industry. Many agencies also focused on helping the unemployed, with some paying young people to do manual labor or related jobs, and others that gave money to help the homeless, providing food, clothes, and nursery schools. However, not everyone liked the New Deal. The rich, for example, disliked it, as they were forced to pay more tax towards agencies that they saw as a waste of money. Business owners had similar objections, also disliking the additional rights given to their workers. The Supreme Court got involved in matters, making some of the alphabet agencies illegal, reducing the help that the poor in society received. Republicans, believing in rugged individualism, disliked the way the government now intervened in people's lives, while some radical politicians came up with different ideas, like Huey Long, who suggested a policy called Share Our Wealth. This idea stated that all wealth over $5 million would be confiscated and shared out, with every family given $5,000 to buy certain items. Other politicians made similarly radical suggestions, but did not gain as much popularity. In the 1936 election, Roosevelt easily won again, defeating Alf London from the Republican Party. It is easy to look at all the things that the New Deal did, or claimed it would do, but it is important to also weigh up its success. It was not liked by everyone, and often there were pros and cons to one aspect. The New Deal created many jobs, for example, which benefited many. Although it did not solve the problem of unemployment, at least 10% of people remained without a job throughout 1930s, and lots of money was spent in the process. To consider if it was successful, we must look at its aims, the 3 Rs, and see if those goals were achieved. The New Deal aimed to provide help for the old, unemployed and homeless, which it did by creating jobs and giving resources to those who needed them most. Bank failures decreased massively as soon as Roosevelt started work, demonstrating the reform aspect of the New Deal. The alphabet agencies also promoted workers' rights, although this significantly increased the days lost to strikes, a negative for the economy. Millions remained in poverty throughout the 1930s, and so in 1935 FDR created the Social Security Act, aimed at helping the elderly, sick, disabled and others. The Wagner Act allowed workers to join a trade union, although large companies still maintained significant power over these organizations. Some farmers benefited from the New Deal, receiving loans, while small-scale farmers often did not receive help and so still struggled. The lives of women also changed through this period, with many finding work through the alphabet agencies, while many still faced discrimination, lower wages, and less job availability. Other marginalized groups, like African Americans and Native Americans, also had mixed experiences in this period. Almost all of both groups still faced severe discrimination, but many African Americans got jobs with the alphabet agencies, and many natives received land, loans, and freedom to manage themselves under the Indian Reservation Act of 1934. Therefore, the New Deal had positive and negative effects on the country, affecting everyone differently. When Roosevelt was re-elected in 1936, he became worried about his significant spending, and so cut down the funding to many of his programs. Unemployment jumped, and by 1939, FDR acknowledged that the New Deal had come to an end. However, it was not all negative during this period. Popular culture continued to develop despite the hardships. To begin with, radios continued to be popular, with over 40% of the country owning one by 1930, allowing them to listen to sports, news, and shows. Movies also remained popular, providing a place for people to escape from their problems. Hollywood grew significantly during this time, allowing many large companies to create a wide variety of films. Comic books also became popular because they were cheap to produce and fun to read, with many famous characters like Superman first making an appearance in this time. Many authors became popular during this time, like John Steinbeck's books about the Depression, aided by the Works Progress Administration, WPA, who paid artists of many kinds to work. These free shows, artwork or books were often criticized, like the rest of the New Deal, as a waste of money. We are now going to move on to the third and final section of this part of the course, the impact of World War II on America. Before the war, America had followed a policy of isolationism, meaning that they kept out of foreign affairs. When World War II started, they started selling weapons and war essentials to Britain and France. FDR was worried about the threats from Germany and Japan when the war broke out, and so persuaded Congress to change the laws that stopped America playing a part in wars, known as the neutrality laws. These laws banned loans to countries at war, the sale of weapons to countries at war, and emphasized that America should stand up to aggressive nations. Britain and France started buying American war materials in the November of 1939, helping the economy greatly. This was known as the Cash and Carry Plan. In March 1941, Roosevelt lent Britain a huge amount of war resources, knowing that he probably wouldn't get them back. This was called a Lend-Lease deal, which was mirrored the time later on, when Russia needed weapons too. Many Americans were afraid of getting dragged into a European war, although millions of jobs were created to supply the war demand. Roosevelt was re-elected in 1940, and by 1941, unemployment had almost halved from 4 years earlier. When Japan began invading nearby nations, FDR cut trading with it, stopping the sale of many materials that were essential to the Japanese industries. This meant that the relationship between the two countries deteriorated until 183 Japanese bomber planes attacked Pearl Harbor, an American military base, in December 1941. 21 warships and 177 planes were damaged or destroyed, with 2,000 people killed, so America and Britain declared war on Japan the day after. This was the moment that the USA entered World War II. At the start of 1942, the War Production Board was set up, converting industries to war work. Car factories made tanks, and silk ribbon factories made parachutes, for example. FDR had ambitiously hoped to produce 50,000 planes in a year, which he achieved in 1943 with 86,000. The war also had huge effects on unemployment. By 1944, there were only 670,000 unemployed, many finding jobs in factories or the army. This increased demand for work, with many men away fighting, allowing women to take places in industries that they couldn't have normally got a job, like factories. Hundreds of thousands joined the armed forces, while 7 million women found employment somewhere. Other marginalized groups, like African Americans, also benefited from the war. The Fair Employment Practice Committee was set up, finding that there was severe discrimination in the workplace and making changes where possible. Approximately 1 million African Americans found jobs in the army, despite severe discrimination, and as the war progressed, many found themselves able to do more, like train as pilots. The war had a few key long-lasting effects on America. Spending on the military increased permanently, civil rights fights were sparked, and a greater trust in the government strictly controlling things, as it had worked during the war. That's the end of part 2 of the course. Have a look on the Revision Realm channel for the other 2 parts to complete your learning. If you found this helpful, send it to your fellow students so that they can benefit too. If there is anything that you think I could improve, add, or change, let me know. Thanks for watching.